The ocean has always been a killing ground. Long before any creature crawled onto land, long before the first forests rose, long before the dinosaurs opened their eyes to a violent world, the seas were already drenched in blood. For more than 500 million years, the oceans of this planet have been ruled by a succession of apex predators, each more terrifying, more powerful, and more perfectly adapted for destruction than the last. They came in every conceivable shape. Some were armored like fortresses. Some were sleek like missiles. Some carried jaws that could crush bone and shell alike. Some grew to sizes so staggering that they dwarfed nearly every predator alive today. And every single one of them, no matter how dominant, no matter how fearsome, eventually fell. Wiped out by catastrophe, replaced by something new, something hungrier, something better built for the world that followed. This is their story. This is the chronicle of the ocean's greatest killers, from the first terrifying hunters of the Cambrian seas to the massive, warm-blooded leviathans that vanished only a few million years ago. This is a history written in teeth and bone, in fossilized death and ancient slaughter. This is the unbroken chain of predation that shaped the seas into the world we know today. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. To understand how the ocean's first great predators arose, we have to go back to a time so ancient, so alien, that the world itself would be unrecognizable. We are talking about a period more than 500 million years ago, a stretch of time so vast that the human mind struggles to truly comprehend it. If you were to somehow travel back to this era and look upon the Earth from space, you would not recognize it. The continents did not exist as we know them. The land was barren, lifeless, scoured by wind and rain with nothing to hold the soil in place. There were no trees. There were no grasses. There were no animals walking on solid ground. The land was a wasteland of rock and sand and volcanic ash, utterly devoid of the green carpet of life that we take for granted today. But the oceans were a different world entirely. Beneath the waves, something extraordinary was happening. Life, which had spent billions of years as nothing more than single-celled organisms, microscopic specks drifting in an endless sea, was suddenly exploding into complexity. This was the Cambrian period, and the event that defines it is one of the most important moments in the entire history of life on Earth. Scientists call it the Cambrian explosion, and it was, in every sense of the word, an eruption of biological creativity unlike anything the planet had ever seen or would ever see again. In the span of just a few tens of millions of years, an eye blink in geological terms, life went from simple, soft-bodied organisms to an astonishing array of complex animals. Creatures with eyes appeared for the first time. Animals with hard shells, with jointed legs, with segmented bodies, with grasping appendages, all of them burst onto the scene in a frenzy of evolutionary innovation. The oceans filled with life in ways that had never been possible before. And where there is life, where there is abundance, there is inevitably something waiting to eat it. The Cambrian seas were not a paradise. They were an arena. And in that arena, the first great predators of the ocean began to take shape. Now, when most people think about the Cambrian period and its predators, one name comes to mind almost immediately. Anomalocaris. This was the creature that for decades held the title of the Cambrian's apex predator. It was a remarkable animal, a meter-long arthropod with large compound eyes, a circular mouth lined with hardened plates, and a pair of flexible, grasping appendages at the front of its head that it used to snatch prey from the water. Anomalocaris was a genuine marvel of early evolution, and its discovery revolutionized our understanding of how quickly complex predatory animals could evolve. But Anomalocaris was not alone. And it was not the largest or the most fearsome predator of its time. In recent years, paleontologists have uncovered evidence of a creature that pushes our understanding of Cambrian predation even further. Its name is Omnidens, and it represents a chapter of the Cambrian story that is still being written, still being debated, still being pieced together from fragments of ancient stone. Omnidens was a large predatory organism from the Cambrian seas, and what sets it apart from many of its contemporaries is the nature of its feeding apparatus. This creature possessed specialized tooth plates, hardened structures designed not merely for grasping soft-bodied prey but for processing tougher food items. These tooth plates suggest an animal that was capable of handling a wider range of prey than many other Cambrian predators, an animal that could bite, crush, and tear in ways that most creatures of its era simply could not. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what the Cambrian Ocean was like. The majority of animals in this period were relatively small, most of them measured in centimeters rather than meters, and the majority of them were either filter feeders, scavengers, or hunters of the very smallest organisms. The food web was still in its infancy. The relationships between predator and prey were still being established for the first time in evolutionary history. In this world, a creature like Omnidens, equipped with genuine crushing and cutting tools, was something entirely new. It was a machine built for destruction in an ocean that had never seen anything like it. The tooth plates of Omnidens tell us something profound about the direction that evolution was already heading. Even in the very earliest chapters of complex animal life, there was a relentless pressure to become a more effective killer. The arms race between predator and prey, the eternal cycle of attack and defense that would come to define the history of life in the oceans, was already underway. Prey animals were developing harder shells, thicker exoskeletons, and defensive spines. And in response, predators like Omnidens were developing the tools to break through those defenses. This is a pattern that would repeat itself over and over again across the next 500 million years. Every time prey found a new way to defend itself, predators found a way around it. Every time a new defensive strategy emerged, a new offensive capability followed. And Omnidens, sitting there in the Cambrian seas with its specialized tooth plates, was one of the very first organisms to embody this principle. But let us not romanticize the Cambrian too much. These were still primitive times, at least by the standards of what was to come. The predators of the Cambrian, fearsome as they were for their era, were operating in a world where the rules of engagement were still being written. The nervous systems of these animals were simple. Their senses, while remarkable for their time, were crude compared to the finely tuned sensory suites that later predators would develop. The Cambrian Ocean was a place of experimentation, where evolution was trying out thousands of different body plans, thousands of different strategies, to see what worked and what did not. And many of them did not work. The Cambrian is littered with evolutionary dead ends, with bizarre, alien-looking creatures that thrived for a time and then vanished forever, leaving no descendants, no legacy, nothing but faint impressions in ancient rock. The hallmark of this period is not just innovation but also failure. For every successful design that survived and gave rise to future lineages, there were dozens that flickered out. But the predators, the successful predators, they set the template. They established the principle that the ocean would always have an apex, a creature sitting at the top of the food chain, exerting its influence on every organism below it. This principle, once established, would never be broken. It persists to this day. The Cambrian eventually gave way to the next great chapter of Earth's history, and with it came new oceans, new ecosystems, and new predators. The transition from the Cambrian to the Ordovician was not a sudden event. It was a gradual shift, a slow transformation of the world's oceans that played out over millions of years. Sea levels rose. The chemistry of the water changed. New habitats opened up. And into those habitats, new forms of life expanded, diversified, and competed for dominance. The Ordovician period, which began roughly 485 million years ago and lasted for about 45 million years, was a time of extraordinary biological diversification. Scientists sometimes refer to the Great Ordovician biodiversification event, a sustained explosion of new species that filled the oceans with a richness of life that far exceeded anything the Cambrian had produced. The seafloor became carpeted with organisms. Coral reefs began to take shape for the first time, or at least structures that functioned like reefs, built by organisms that were distant relatives of modern corals. Brachiopods, bryozoans, crinids, and trilobites proliferated in staggering numbers. The oceans were teeming with life, and that life was becoming more complex, more interconnected, and more stratified. And at the top of this new, richer food web, a new kind of predator was rising. To picture the apex predator of the Ordovician seas, you have to abandon everything you know about modern ocean predators. There were no sharks. There were no bony fish, at least not in any form you would recognize. There were no marine reptiles, no whales, nothing with a backbone that had yet evolved into a truly dominant predatory form. The rulers of the Ordovician Ocean were the cephalopods, and chief among them was a creature called Endoceras. Endoceras was a nautiloid, a member of the great cephalopod lineage that would eventually give rise to modern squids, octopuses, and the chambered nautilus. But Endoceras looked nothing like any of those animals. It was a giant, and it carried its body inside a massive, cone-shaped shell that could reach extraordinary lengths. Estimates of the largest Endoceras shells suggest that this creature could reach lengths of up to 6 meters, roughly 20 feet, making it one of the largest animals on the planet at that time. Some researchers have suggested that certain specimens may have been even larger, though the fragmentary nature of the fossil record makes it difficult to be certain. Imagine this creature gliding through the Ordovician seas. Its shell was long and straight, tapering from a broad opening at the front to a narrow point at the rear. Inside that shell, the animal's soft body occupied the forward chambers, while the rear chambers were filled with gas and fluid, a sophisticated buoyancy system that allowed Endoceras to control its position in the water column. At the front of the shell, the animal's head emerged, equipped with large eyes and a ring of tentacles that it used to grasp its prey. And like all cephalopods, it had a beak, a hard, parrot-like structure at the center of its tentacle ring that it used to bite into the flesh and shell of its victims. Endoceras was not a fast swimmer. The straight-shelled nautiloids of the Ordovician were not built for speed or agility. They were ambush predators, lurking in the midwater or near the bottom, waiting for prey to come within striking distance. But what they lacked in speed, they made up for in sheer size and power. In an ocean where most animals were measured in centimeters, a 6-meter predator was an absolute colossus. Nothing in the Ordovician seas could challenge an adult Endoceras. It was the undisputed ruler of its world. The diet of Endoceras likely consisted of whatever it could catch and overpower. Trilobites, which were among the most common animals of the Ordovician seafloor, were almost certainly on the menu. These armored arthropods came in a huge variety of shapes and sizes, and while their exoskeletons provided some protection against smaller predators, they would have been no match for the powerful beak of a giant nautiloid. Sea scorpions, early fish, and other smaller cephalopods were also likely prey items. But what made Endoceras truly significant was not just its size. It was what it represented. This was the first time in the history of life on Earth that a cephalopod had risen to the absolute pinnacle of the oceanic food chain. And it would not be the last. Cephalopods, in one form or another, would remain among the most important predators in the ocean for hundreds of millions of years. The lineage that produced Endoceras was the beginning of a dynasty that would evolve and adapt and diversify across multiple geological periods, producing some of the most remarkable predators the oceans have ever known. The Ordovician world of Endoceras was a world without fish, at least not fish as we would recognize them. The early vertebrates of this period were small, jawless creatures that posed no threat to anything larger than a plankton. They were filter feeders for the most part, sucking up nutrients from the water or scraping organic material from the seafloor. The idea that these humble, defenseless little animals would one day give rise to sharks, to tuna, to swordfish, to the most dominant vertebrate predators the ocean would ever know, would have seemed absurd. But evolution has a long memory and an even longer patience. The vertebrates were biding their time. The Ordovician period did not end quietly. It ended in catastrophe. Approximately 443 million years ago, the Earth was struck by one of the most devastating mass extinctions in its history, the late Ordovician mass extinction. This event, driven by a combination of severe glaciation, falling sea levels, and dramatic changes in ocean chemistry, wiped out an estimated 85% of all marine species. The thriving, diverse ecosystems that had filled the Ordovician seas were decimated. Entire lineages were erased. The coral-like reefs crumbled. The trilobite populations were slashed. And the great cephalopods, including Endoceras, were hit hard. But extinction, as we will see over and over again in this story, is not just an ending. It is also a beginning. When the dust settles, when the oceans recover, the empty ecological niches left behind by the vanished species become opportunities for the survivors. New predators rise to fill the void left by the old ones. And the cycle begins again. The period that followed the Ordovician extinction was the Silurian, and it was during this time that one of the most terrifying groups of predators the world has ever known truly came into its own. We are talking about the Eurypterids, the sea scorpions, and their greatest representative was a monster called Gecalopterus. The Silurian period lasted from roughly 443 million years ago to 419 million years ago, and it was a time of recovery, rebuilding, and renewal. The oceans, devastated by the end-Ordovician extinction, slowly refilled with life. New species evolved to replace those that had been lost. Coral reefs reappeared, this time built by true corals and stromatoporids. Fish began to diversify, developing new body plans, new feeding strategies, and crucially, jaws. The Silurian was the period when jawed fish first appeared, a development that would eventually revolutionize the entire marine ecosystem. But in the Silurian itself, fish were still small, still relatively insignificant players in the grand scheme of things. The real power in the Silurian seas belonged to the arthropods. And the most powerful arthropod of them all was Gecalopterus rhenanii. Gecalopterus was a Eurypterid, a member of a group of aquatic arthropods that first appeared in the Ordovician and reached their peak diversity and size during the Silurian and Devonian periods. Eurypterids are often called sea scorpions, though this name is somewhat misleading. While they were indeed related to modern scorpions, and some of them did bear a superficial resemblance to their terrestrial cousins, they were a distinct group with their own unique adaptations and ecological roles. And Gecalopterus was the largest of them all. Based on fossil evidence, specifically a massive chelicera, or claw, discovered in Germany, scientists have estimated that Gecalopterus could reach lengths of up to 2.5 meters, more than 8 feet long. This makes it the largest arthropod known to have ever lived. Larger than any insect, larger than any spider, larger than any crab or lobster. Gecalopterus was an arthropod on a scale that the modern world cannot match. Picture this creature in your mind. Over 8 feet long, with a broad, flattened body encased in a tough exoskeleton. At the front of its body, a pair of enormous chelicerae, grasping claws equipped with sharp teeth along their inner edges, designed for seizing and holding prey. Behind the chelicerae, multiple pairs of walking legs and a pair of broad, paddle-like rear appendages that it used for swimming. Its tail ended in a broad, flat telson that may have helped with steering or stability in the water. Its eyes were compound, like those of an insect, but large and well-developed, giving it excellent vision for detecting movement in the murky waters it inhabited. Gecalopterus was a predator of the highest order. Its chelicerae were weapons, plain and simple. They were large enough and strong enough to seize virtually any animal in the Silurian seas and hold it fast while the predator devoured it. The teeth along the inner edges of the chelicerae were not for chewing. Arthropods do not chew their food the way mammals do, but for gripping and tearing. Gecalopterus would have seized its prey, held it in its chelicerae, and used its other mouthparts to break the food into pieces small enough to consume. What did Gecalopterus eat? The answer is almost certainly everything it could catch. In the Silurian seas, potential prey items included smaller eurypterids, trilobites, early fish, worms, and various other invertebrates. Gecalopterus was an apex predator in the truest sense of the term. Nothing in its environment was equipped to challenge it. Nothing could threaten an adult specimen. It was the undisputed king of the Silurian waters. But here is something that makes Gecalopterus even more interesting. The eurypterids, including Gecalopterus, were not strictly marine animals. Many eurypterids are found in sediments that indicate brackish or even freshwater environments. The sea scorpions were versatile, capable of living in a range of aquatic habitats, from the open ocean to coastal lagoons to rivers and lakes. Gecalopterus itself may have spent much of its time in freshwater or brackish environments, hunting in rivers and estuaries where its enormous size would have made it the absolute master of its domain. This adaptability was one of the keys to the Eurypterid's success. While many marine organisms were restricted to specific environments, the sea scorpions could move between different habitats, exploiting food sources that were unavailable to their more specialized competitors. This flexibility allowed them to thrive for millions of years and to dominate ecosystems across a wide range of environments. The success of Gecalopterus and its relatives also tells us something important about the state of the marine ecosystem during the Silurian. The fact that an arthropod could grow to such enormous size and occupy the apex predator role indicates that the vertebrates, specifically the fish, had not yet evolved to a point where they could compete for that role. Fish were diversifying during the Silurian, and jawed fish were beginning to appear, but they were still relatively small and lacked the size and weaponry to challenge a giant Eurypterid. The age of fish dominance was coming, but it had not yet arrived. The Eurypterids enjoyed their reign, but their days were numbered. The forces of evolution were working against them, slowly but relentlessly. The fish were getting bigger. They were getting stronger. They were developing jaws with real teeth, jaws that could bite and crush and tear. And in the next geological period, the Devonian, the fish would finally seize the throne. The Devonian period, which lasted from roughly 419 million years ago to 359 million years ago, is often called the Age of Fishes, and for good reason. This was the period when fish truly came into their own, diversifying into an astonishing array of forms and filling virtually every ecological niche in the ocean. Sharks appeared for the first time, their cartilaginous skeletons and efficient body plans giving them advantages that would serve them well for hundreds of millions of years. Bony fish proliferated, developing the ray-finned and lobe-finned body plans that would give rise to the vast majority of modern fish species. And one particular group of fish, the placoderms, rose to a level of dominance that the oceans had never before witnessed from any vertebrate. The placoderms were armored fish. Their heads and the front portions of their bodies were encased in heavy bony plates, giving them a tank-like appearance that was both intimidating and functional. These plates provided protection against predators and may have also served a role in display and species recognition. But the most remarkable feature of many placoderms was their jaws, and no placoderm exemplified this more dramatically than Dunkleistus. Dunkleistus turelli? Even the name sounds formidable. This was an animal that embodied the concept of apex predation in a way that few creatures before or since have matched. Dunkleistus was massive, with estimates of its total length ranging from roughly 6 to 9 meters, about 20 to 30 feet, depending on the species and the method of estimation. Some researchers have suggested that the largest specimens may have been even bigger, though the exact maximum size remains a subject of debate because the rear portions of Dunkleistus bodies, which were not covered in bony armor, are rarely preserved in the fossil record. What is preserved, and preserved beautifully, is the head. The skull of Dunkleistus is one of the most impressive fossils in all of paleontology. It is massive, heavily armored, and equipped with a jaw apparatus that has fascinated scientists for over a century. Unlike modern fish, which have teeth made of dentine and enamel, Dunkleistus had no true teeth at all. Instead, its jaws were lined with sharp, blade-like extensions of the bony plates that covered its head. These bony blades were self-sharpening, meaning that as the upper and lower jaw blades scraped against each other during the biting action, they maintained a razor-sharp edge. Every time Dunkleistus closed its mouth, its blades were honed, ensuring that the cutting edges remained lethal throughout the animal's life. The bite force of Dunkleistus has been the subject of detailed biomechanical analysis, and the results are staggering. Studies have estimated that Dunkleistus could generate a bite force at the tip of its jaw blades of approximately 8,000 newtons, with some estimates going even higher. To put that in perspective, a modern great white shark generates a bite force of roughly 1,800 newtons. Dunkleistus was biting with several times the force of a great white shark, and it was doing so with blades rather than teeth, concentrating that force along a thin, razor-sharp edge. The effect of this bite on prey animals would have been catastrophic. Dunkleistus could have sliced through the armored shells of other placoderms, through the exoskeletons of Eurypterids, through virtually any biological material that existed in the Devonian seas. There is evidence in the fossil record of Edestus prey items, fragments of bone and shell with clean-cut marks that match the jaw blades of this predator. There is even evidence that Edestus may have regurgitated the indigestible parts of its meals, much like modern owls produce pellets of bone and fur. Fossil assemblages containing concentrated accumulations of partially digested fish bones have been found in association with Edestus remains, suggesting that this predator was consuming large amounts of bony prey and expelling what it could not digest. But the jaw blades were not just cutting tools. Biomechanical studies have shown that Edestus had an incredibly fast bite. The jaw mechanism was designed for rapid opening and closing, allowing the animal to create a sudden drop in pressure at the front of its mouth when it opened its jaws. This suction effect would have helped to draw prey into the mouth, a technique used by many modern fish but executed by Edestus on a much grander scale. The combination of speed, power, and cutting efficiency made the Edestus bite one of the most devastating feeding mechanisms in the history of life. Edestus was not a graceful swimmer. Its massive armored head made it front-heavy, and it likely lacked the sustained speed and agility of more streamlined predators. But it did not need to be fast. Edestus was built for power, not for pursuit. It was an ambush predator, a creature that relied on short bursts of acceleration to close the distance to its prey, followed by a single devastating bite. In the confined spaces of Devonian reef systems, this strategy would have been highly effective. Prey had nowhere to run, and when Edestus struck, there was no surviving the impact. The dominance of Edestus marked a turning point in the history of marine predation. For the first time, a vertebrate, a fish, had risen to the absolute pinnacle of the oceanic food chain. The reign of the arthropods was over. The eurypterids, which had ruled the seas during the Silurian, were declining. They would persist for millions of years more, but they would never again hold the title of apex predator. The age of vertebrate supremacy in the oceans had begun, and it would never end. Edestus itself did not survive the end of the Devonian. The placoderms, as a group, were wiped out by the late Devonian extinction, a series of extinction pulses that devastated marine ecosystems approximately 372 to 359 million years ago. The causes of this extinction are still debated, but the effects were clear. The placoderms, which had been the dominant fish group for tens of millions of years, vanished entirely. Not a single species survived. Their ecological niches were left vacant, waiting to be filled by the next generation of predators. And the next generation was already waiting in the wings. The sharks, which had first appeared during the Devonian, had survived the extinction relatively unscathed. And in the period that followed, the Carboniferous, they would diversify into some of the most bizarre and terrifying forms the ocean has ever produced. The Carboniferous period, lasting from approximately 359 million years ago to 299 million years ago, is best known for its vast swampy forests and the giant insects that inhabited them. On land, this was the age of dragonflies with 2-foot wingspans and millipedes the length of a car. But in the seas, a different kind of evolution was taking place. The sharks, freed from competition with the now extinct placoderms, were radiating into a wild array of forms, experimenting with body plans and dental arrangements that would seem outlandish by modern standards. And the most outlandish of them all was Edestus. Edestus is one of those creatures that makes you question whether evolution has a sense of humor. It was a shark, or at least a close relative of modern sharks, belonging to a group called the Eugeniodontida. But its teeth were arranged in a manner that defies easy description. Most sharks, both ancient and modern, replaced their teeth in a conveyor belt fashion. As old teeth at the front of the jaw wear down or break, new teeth grow in from behind and move forward to take their place. The old teeth are shed, falling to the seafloor, which is why shark teeth are among the most common fossils found in marine sediments. Edestus did not shed its teeth. Instead, as new teeth grew in, the old teeth were pushed forward but remained attached to the jaw, creating a long, curved row of teeth that extended out from the mouth like a pair of serrated pinking shears. The upper jaw bore a curved row of teeth pointing downward, and the lower jaw bore a corresponding row pointing upward. The overall effect was something like a pair of scissors, which is why Edestus has earned the nickname scissor-toothed shark. The exact function of this extraordinary dental arrangement has been the subject of considerable debate among paleontologists. Some have suggested that Edestus used its tooth rows like a saw, slashing through schools of fish with a side-to-side motion of its head. Others have proposed that the teeth were used for vertical slashing, with Edestus snapping its jaws shut to bring the upper and lower tooth rows together like the blades of a pair of shears. Still others have suggested that the tooth rows served a display function, perhaps playing a role in mating rituals or territorial disputes. Whatever the exact function, the teeth of Edestus were clearly formidable weapons. Each individual tooth was large, sharp, and equipped with serrated edges that would have been highly effective at cutting through flesh. The total size of Edestus is difficult to determine with precision because, like all sharks, its skeleton was made of cartilage rather than bone, and cartilage rarely preserves well in the fossil record. But based on the size of the tooth whorls that have been found, scientists estimate that the largest Edestus specimens may have reached lengths of 6 to 7 meters, roughly 20 to 23 feet. This would have made it one of the largest predators in the Carboniferous seas. Edestus was not the only bizarre shark of the Carboniferous. This period produced an extraordinary rogues gallery of chondrichthyans, cartilaginous fish with body plans that seem almost alien by modern standards. There were sharks with anvil-shaped projections on their heads, sharks with elaborate whorls of teeth that looked like circular saws, sharks with spines and hooks and ridges that served purposes we can only guess at. The Carboniferous was a time of wild experimentation among the sharks, a period when the group was trying out every conceivable variation on the basic shark body plan to see what worked. And many of these experiments worked well enough to persist for millions of years. The Carboniferous sharks filled a wide range of ecological niches, from small bottom-dwelling forms that fed on shellfish to large open-water predators that hunted fish and other sharks. The diversity was extraordinary, and it laid the groundwork for the long-term success of the shark lineage, which continues to this day. But the Carboniferous did not last forever, and the world was about to enter one of the most challenging periods in the history of life on Earth. The Permian period, which followed the Carboniferous, would culminate in the most devastating mass extinction the planet has ever experienced, an event so catastrophic that it came within a hair's breadth of wiping out life entirely. The Permian period lasted from approximately 299 million years ago to 252 million years ago, and it was a time of dramatic change. The continents were drifting together, slowly assembling into the supercontinent Pangaea. The world's climate was shifting, becoming more arid in many regions as the interior of the massive landmass dried out. The oceans were changing too, with circulation patterns and chemistry fluctuating in response to the changing geography of the planet. In the Permian seas, the ecological landscape was different from what had come before. The placoderms were long gone. The eurypterids were fading, reduced to a handful of species that would not survive the period. The sharks were still diverse and important, but they were sharing the oceans with a growing array of other predatory fish and with increasingly sophisticated invertebrate communities. Among the most fascinating predators of the Permian seas were the helicoprionids, a group of cartilaginous fish related to modern ratfish and chimeras. And the most famous of these, and one of the most enigmatic creatures in the entire fossil record, is Parahelicoprion. Parahelicoprion belongs to a group of fish that possessed one of the most puzzling anatomical features ever discovered in a vertebrate, a tooth whorl. This structure consisted of a spiral of teeth, arranged in a coil somewhat like a circular saw blade, that was located in the lower jaw. The exact arrangement and function of this tooth whorl has been debated for well over a century, ever since the first specimens were discovered in the late 1800s. For decades, scientists struggled to determine exactly where in the body the tooth whorl was located and how it was used. Early reconstructions placed the whorl in all sorts of improbable positions, on the snout, hanging from the lower jaw like a bizarre proboscis, curled up under the chin. It was not until modern CT scanning technology allowed researchers to examine well-preserved specimens in 3 dimensions that the true arrangement was finally determined. The tooth whorl was located entirely within the lower jaw, with the oldest, smallest teeth at the center of the spiral and the newest, largest teeth at the outer edge. As new teeth grew in, the older teeth were pushed inward and upward, creating the spiral pattern. The function of this saw-like jaw structure was almost certainly related to feeding, though the exact mechanics are still debated. One popular hypothesis is that Parahelicoprion used the tooth whorl to slash at soft-bodied prey, such as cephalopods, creating wounds that would incapacitate the prey and allow the predator to consume it. The spiral arrangement of the teeth would have created a continuous cutting surface, allowing the fish to inflict damage with a single sweeping motion of the jaw. Others have suggested that the tooth whorl was used for processing hard-shelled prey, crushing ammonite shells or breaking open the exoskeletons of crustaceans. The truth is that we may never know for certain exactly how Parahelicoprion used its extraordinary dentition, but we can say with confidence that it was an effective predator. The fact that the helicoprionid lineage persisted for tens of millions of years, spanning from the Carboniferous well into the Permian and possibly beyond, tells us that the tooth whorl, however strange it may look to our eyes, was a successful evolutionary innovation. Parahelicoprion and its relatives lived in a world that was heading toward disaster. The late Permian was a time of increasing environmental stress, as volcanic activity, changes in ocean chemistry, and shifts in global climate conspired to push marine ecosystems to the breaking point. And then, approximately 252 million years ago, the breaking point was reached. The Permian-Triassic extinction, often called the Great Dying, was the most severe mass extinction in the history of life on Earth. It is estimated that 90 to 96% of all marine species were wiped out. The oceans were essentially sterilized. Entire ecosystems collapsed. The causes of this catastrophe are complex and still debated, but the primary driver appears to have been the eruption of the Siberian Traps, one of the largest volcanic events in Earth's history. These eruptions poured unimaginable quantities of lava, carbon dioxide, and toxic gases into the atmosphere over a period of roughly 1 million years, triggering runaway global warming, ocean acidification, anoxia, and a cascade of environmental catastrophes that life simply could not withstand. The Great Dying reset the clock of marine evolution. When the dust finally settled, when the oceans slowly began to recover, the world that emerged was fundamentally different from the one that had existed before. The old predators were gone. The old food webs were shattered. And into this devastated world, a new generation of life would emerge, a generation that would produce some of the largest and most spectacular marine predators the planet has ever seen. The Triassic period, which followed the Permian extinction, was a time of recovery and reinvention. It lasted from approximately 252 million years ago to 201 million years ago, and it saw the gradual rebuilding of marine ecosystems that had been devastated by the Great Dying. This recovery was slow at first. The early Triassic oceans were impoverished, with low diversity and simple food webs. But as conditions stabilized, as oxygen levels rose and ocean chemistry returned to more hospitable conditions, life began to diversify once again. And this time, a completely new group of animals would claim the title of apex predator. They were not fish. They were not arthropods. They were not cephalopods. They were reptiles. The marine reptiles of the Mesozoic era represent one of the most successful and spectacular episodes of secondary adaptation in the history of life. These were animals whose ancestors had lived on land, breathing air, walking on legs, laying eggs on solid ground. But over time, driven by the abundant food resources available in the ocean, various lineages of reptiles returned to the water and evolved to become fully aquatic. They developed streamlined bodies, paddle-like limbs, and a host of physiological adaptations that allowed them to thrive in the marine environment. And among the most successful of these marine reptile groups were the ichthyosaurs. Ichthyosaurs first appeared in the early Triassic, not long after the Permian-Triassic extinction, and they evolved rapidly into a diverse group of marine predators. The early ichthyosaurs were relatively small, elongated creatures that probably swam by undulating their bodies from side to side, much like modern lizards do when they swim. But over time, they evolved the classic ichthyosaur body plan that would persist for more than 150 million years, a sleek, dolphin-like shape with a pointed snout, large eyes, a dorsal fin, a crescent-shaped tail, and 4 paddle-shaped limbs that served as stabilizers and steering devices. This body plan was remarkably convergent with that of modern dolphins and tuna, a testament to the fact that certain shapes are simply optimal for fast, efficient swimming. The ichthyosaurs hit upon this design independently, arriving at the same solution through a completely different evolutionary pathway. This is one of the most beautiful examples of convergent evolution in the natural world, proof that the laws of physics impose certain constraints on biological design that transcend the boundaries of lineage and ancestry. But while the classic dolphin-shaped ichthyosaurs are well known, the most spectacular members of the group were the giants of the Triassic, and the most awe-inspiring of them all is a creature that has only recently been described by science. Its name is Ichthyodon. Ichthyodon is a name that means fish titan, and it is entirely appropriate. This animal was enormous, one of the largest marine reptiles ever to have lived, and possibly one of the largest marine animals of any kind to have existed before the evolution of the great whales. The evidence for Ichthyodon comes from fragmentary but tantalizing fossil remains, including pieces of jawbone that, when compared to more complete ichthyosaur skeletons, suggest an animal of truly staggering proportions. How big was Ichthyodon? Based on the available evidence, scientists have estimated that this creature may have reached lengths of 25 meters or more. That is over 80 feet, comparable in size to a modern fin whale, or even a blue whale. Let that sink in for a moment. A reptile, an air-breathing animal that had descended from land-dwelling ancestors, had evolved to rival the largest animals alive today in size. And it did this more than 200 million years ago, in a world that was still recovering from the worst mass extinction in history. The sheer size of Ichthyodon raises a host of fascinating questions about its biology and ecology. What did it eat? An animal of this size would have required enormous quantities of food to sustain itself. The Triassic oceans were rich in cephalopods, fish, and other marine organisms, but feeding a creature the size of a whale would have been no small feat. Some researchers have suggested that the largest ichthyosaurs may have been filter feeders, like modern baleen whales, straining enormous quantities of small organisms from the water. Others have argued that they were active predators, hunting large fish and cephalopods. The truth may lie somewhere in between, or it may be that different species of giant ichthyosaur employed different feeding strategies. How did Ichthyodon breathe? Like all ichthyosaurs, it was an air breather, which means it had to surface regularly to take in oxygen. For an animal of this size, surfacing would have been a significant event, a massive body breaking through the surface of the water, exhaling and inhaling in great, whooshing breaths before diving back into the depths. The physiology required to support diving in such a large air-breathing animal would have been remarkable, probably involving adaptations similar to those seen in modern deep-diving whales, such as increased oxygen-carrying capacity in the blood, collapsible lungs, and the ability to slow the heart rate during extended dives. How did Ichthyodon reproduce? Ichthyosaurs were viviparous, meaning they gave birth to live young rather than laying eggs. This was a crucial adaptation for a fully aquatic animal, since returning to land to lay eggs would have been impossible for a creature the size of Ichthyodon. Fossil evidence from other ichthyosaur species shows embryos preserved inside the body cavities of adult specimens, confirming that live birth was the norm for the group. The babies of Ichthyodon would have been born tail first, just like modern whales and dolphins, to minimize the risk of drowning during the birth process. Ichthyodon represents the pinnacle of ichthyosaur evolution, the ultimate expression of a body plan that was perfected over millions of years of natural selection. But even this magnificent creature could not last forever. The ichthyosaurs as a group would eventually decline, their diversity diminishing through the Jurassic and into the Cretaceous, until the last of their kind vanished roughly 90 million years ago, long before the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. But before the ichthyosaurs faded, the Triassic would give way to the Jurassic, and the Jurassic would produce its own champion of the seas, a predator that was built not for size but for raw, devastating power. The Jurassic period lasted from approximately 201 million years ago to 145 million years ago, and it was a golden age for marine reptiles. The oceans were warm, productive, and filled with life. Ammonites, the coiled-shelled cephalopods that would become one of the most iconic fossil groups of the Mesozoic, proliferated in staggering numbers. Fish were diverse and abundant. And at the top of the food chain, multiple lineages of marine reptiles competed for supremacy. The ichthyosaurs were still present, though they were no longer producing the colossal giants of the Triassic. The plesiosaurs, a new group of marine reptiles characterized by their long necks, small heads, and 4 large flippers, were diversifying rapidly. And then there were the pliosaurs. The pliosaurs were the short-necked, large-headed members of the plesiosaur group, and they were among the most formidable predators the oceans have ever produced. While their long-necked relatives were designed for chasing small, agile prey through the water, the pliosaurs were built for power. They had massive skulls, robust jaws, and teeth that could handle virtually any prey item in the Jurassic seas. And the greatest of the pliosaurs, the one that stands above all others as the ultimate Jurassic marine predator, was Pliosaurus. Pliosaurus was a monster. The largest species in the genus may have reached lengths of 10 to 12 meters, roughly 33 to 40 feet, and some fragmentary remains suggest that even larger individuals may have existed. Its skull alone could measure over 2 meters in length, a massive, heavily built structure that housed a jaw apparatus of extraordinary power. The teeth of Pliosaurus were large, conical, and deeply rooted in the jaw. They were not flat or blade-like, as in some other predators. They were designed for gripping and crushing, for seizing prey in a vice-like hold and either swallowing it whole or breaking it into pieces. The teeth interlocked when the jaws closed, creating a cage of bone and enamel from which nothing could escape. But the most impressive aspect of Pliosaurus was its bite force. Biomechanical analyses of the jaw muscles and skull structure of Pliosaurus have produced estimates of bite force that are frankly astonishing. Some studies have estimated that Pliosaurus could generate a bite force of approximately 42,000 newtons. To put that number in context, a modern saltwater crocodile, which has one of the strongest bites of any living animal, generates a bite force of roughly 16,000 newtons. Pliosaurus was biting with more than 2.5 times the force of a saltwater crocodile, an animal that can crush bone and turtle shell with ease. 42,000 newtons. That is enough force to crush virtually anything biological. The ammonites that filled the Jurassic seas, with their coiled shells of aragonite, would have been helpless against such a bite. Other marine reptiles, including ichthyosaurs and smaller plesiosaurs, would have been viable prey items. Even other pliosaurs would have been at risk from an adult pliosaurus in a territorial or competitive encounter. The hunting strategy of Pliosaurus was likely based on stealth and ambush rather than sustained pursuit. While pliosaurs were capable swimmers, powered by 4 large flippers that they used in a distinctive underwater flying motion, they were not built for the kind of high-speed chasing that characterized more streamlined predators. Instead, Pliosaurus probably stalked its prey from below, using the darkness of deeper water to conceal its approach, then surging upward in a burst of speed to strike before the prey could react. This is a hunting strategy employed by many modern marine predators, including great white sharks and Humboldt squid, and it is highly effective when executed by an animal of sufficient size and power. The sensory capabilities of Pliosaurus are another subject of considerable interest. Like all plesiosaurs, Pliosaurus had relatively small olfactory bulbs, suggesting that its sense of smell was not its primary hunting tool. Instead, it likely relied heavily on its eyesight and possibly on a sensitivity to water pressure changes, allowing it to detect the movements of prey animals even in low-visibility conditions. Some researchers have even speculated that pliosaurs may have possessed a form of electroreception, the ability to detect the weak electrical fields generated by the muscles and nerves of other animals, similar to the ampullae of Lorenzini found in modern sharks. This is purely speculative at present, as there is no direct fossil evidence for such a sense in pliosaurs, but it is an intriguing possibility. Pliosaurus lived in seas that were, by any measure, dangerous places. The Jurassic oceans were home to a dizzying array of predators, from fast, agile ichthyosaurs to stealthy, long-necked plesiosaurs to various species of shark and predatory fish. Competition for food was intense, and the waters were patrolled by multiple species of large, powerful predators at all times. In this environment, the sheer size and power of Pliosaurus gave it a decisive advantage. It was the apex of the apex, the predator that no other predator dared to challenge. But the Jurassic eventually came to an end, and with it, the era of Pliosaurus. The transition from the Jurassic to the Cretaceous was not marked by a major extinction event, at least not on the scale of the end-Permian or end-Ordovician disasters, but the marine ecosystem underwent significant changes nonetheless. New groups of organisms appeared and diversified. Old groups declined. And the throne of the ocean's apex predator was once again up for grabs. The Cretaceous period was the last and longest of the three periods that make up the Mesozoic era, spanning from approximately 145 million years ago to 66 million years ago. It was a time of warm climates, high sea levels, and extraordinary biological diversity. The oceans of the Cretaceous were vast, covering much more of the Earth's surface than they do today, and they were incredibly productive, supporting some of the most complex marine ecosystems in the history of life. In the early Cretaceous, the ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs still dominated the marine predator guild, much as they had during the Jurassic. But as the period progressed, a new group of predators began to emerge, a group that would eventually displace all competitors and reign as the supreme hunters of the Cretaceous seas. These were the mosasaurs. The mosasaurs were marine reptiles, but they were not closely related to the ichthyosaurs or plesiosaurs. Instead, they were members of the squamate order, the same group that includes modern lizards and snakes. Their closest living relatives are the monitor lizards, animals like the Komodo dragon, and the evolutionary relationship between mosasaurs and monitors is one of the most fascinating stories in vertebrate paleontology. The earliest mosasaurs appeared in the mid-Cretaceous, roughly 98 to 90 million years ago, and they evolved from small, semi-aquatic lizards that lived in shallow coastal waters. Over time, they became increasingly adapted to life in the open ocean, developing elongated bodies, paddle-like limbs, and powerful tails that propelled them through the water with devastating efficiency. By the late Cretaceous, the mosasaurs had diversified into a wide range of forms, from small, fish-eating species to enormous apex predators that were the undisputed rulers of the sea. And the most famous of these apex predators, the one whose name has become synonymous with Cretaceous marine terror, was Mosasaurus. Mosasaurus hoffmanii, the type species of the genus, was a truly colossal animal. The largest specimens are estimated to have reached lengths of 13 to 17 meters, roughly 43 to 56 feet, making it one of the largest marine predators of all time. Its body was elongated and streamlined, built for efficient swimming in the open ocean. Its forelimbs had been modified into paddle-shaped flippers that were used primarily for steering and stability rather than for propulsion. The main source of thrust was the tail, which was long, muscular, and equipped with a large, crescent-shaped tail fin that drove the animal through the water with powerful lateral strokes. The skull of Mosasaurus was long, robust, and armed with an impressive array of teeth. The teeth were conical and slightly recurved, designed for gripping rather than cutting. They were set in powerful jaws that could open wide and close with tremendous force, allowing Mosasaurus to seize and hold even the largest and most struggling prey. But the most remarkable feature of the mosasaur skull was the presence of a second row of teeth on the pterygoid bones of the palate. These palatal teeth acted as a secondary gripping mechanism, preventing prey from escaping once it had been seized by the primary jaw teeth. Once something was in the mouth of a mosasaurus, it was not getting out. This double row of teeth, combined with the flexible skull construction that is characteristic of squamate reptiles, gave Mosasaurus a feeding apparatus that was in some ways more efficient than those of the pliosaurs and ichthyosaurs that had come before it. The flexible skull allowed the jaws to spread slightly, accommodating larger prey items, while the palatal teeth ensured that nothing could slip free. Mosasaurus could swallow large prey items whole, or it could use its powerful jaws to tear chunks from carcasses and from prey too large to swallow in one piece. What did Mosasaurus eat? The answer, supported by extensive fossil evidence, is essentially anything it wanted. Stomach contents preserved in mosasaur fossils have revealed an extraordinarily varied diet, including fish, sharks, sea turtles, ammonites, plesiosaurs, seabirds, and even other mosasaurs. Mosasaurus was an equal opportunity predator, an animal that would attack and consume virtually any organism it encountered. This dietary flexibility was one of the keys to its success. In an ocean where food sources could be unpredictable and where competition with other large predators was intense, the ability to eat a wide range of prey was a significant advantage. The senses of Mosasaurus were well developed and finely tuned for predation. Its eyes were large and forward-facing, giving it good binocular vision that would have been useful for judging distances when striking at prey. Its sense of smell was probably acute, as mosasaurs possessed well-developed olfactory organs that would have allowed them to detect the scent of blood or decaying flesh from considerable distances. And like their modern monitor lizard relatives, mosasaurs may have used their forked tongues to sample chemical cues from the water, a form of chemoreception that could have complemented their other senses. Mosasaurus was not just large and powerful, it was also surprisingly agile. Despite its massive size, the mosasaur body plan was designed for maneuverability as well as speed. The paddle-like flippers, while not capable of generating the thrust produced by the tail, served as highly effective rudders, allowing the animal to change direction quickly and to execute tight turns. This agility would have been a significant advantage when hunting fast-moving prey or when competing with rival predators. The dominance of Mosasaurus and its mosasaur relatives in the late Cretaceous seas was absolute. By the last few million years of the Cretaceous, mosasaurs had become the most diverse and abundant group of large marine predators on the planet. They had filled ecological niches that had previously been occupied by ichthyosaurs, pliosaurs, and large predatory fish. They had become the undisputed masters of the ocean, a position they would hold until the very end. And the end, when it came, was sudden and catastrophic. 66 million years ago, an asteroid roughly 10 to 12 kilometers in diameter struck the Earth in what is now the Yucatan Peninsula region. The impact released energy equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons, triggering a chain of events that would reshape the planet and end the Mesozoic era. The immediate effects included a massive shockwave, global wildfires, and a tsunami of unimaginable proportions. But the most devastating consequence was the cloud of dust and debris that was lofted into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight for months or even years and plunging the Earth into a period of darkness and cold that devastated ecosystems on land and in the sea. The Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction, as this event is known, wiped out approximately 75% of all species on Earth. The non-avian dinosaurs were among the most famous victims, but the marine realm was equally devastated. The mosasaurs, every last species, were wiped out. The plesiosaurs vanished. The ammonites, which had been one of the most successful marine invertebrate groups for more than 300 million years, were exterminated. The marine food web collapsed, and the oceans became, for a time, a biological desert. But as we have seen before, extinction is the mother of innovation. The void left by the vanished Mesozoic predators created opportunities for new animals to rise, to diversify, and to claim the throne. And in the wake of the Cretaceous extinction, the group that would eventually produce the next great ocean apex predators was perhaps the most unlikely candidate imaginable. They were mammals. The Paleogene period, which followed the Cretaceous extinction, saw the gradual recovery and rebuilding of marine ecosystems. It also saw one of the most remarkable evolutionary transitions in the history of life, the return of mammals to the sea. Mammals had been small, insignificant creatures during the age of dinosaurs, living in the shadows of the great reptiles and eking out a marginal existence. But with the dinosaurs gone, mammals exploded in diversity, filling ecological niches on land and eventually in the water. The earliest whales, or cetaceans, appeared in the early Eocene, roughly 55 to 50 million years ago, and they evolved from small, four-legged terrestrial mammals that lived in and around bodies of water. The transition from land to sea was gradual, progressing through a series of intermediate forms that spent increasingly more time in the water and less time on land. The earliest cetaceans still had functional legs, still could walk on land, still bore many of the hallmarks of their terrestrial ancestors. But over time, their bodies became increasingly modified for aquatic life, their legs shrinking, their tails expanding, their nostrils migrating from the front of the snout to the top of the head to form the blowhole that is characteristic of modern whales. And among the most spectacular of these early whales was Basilosaurus. Basilosaurus is one of those animals whose name is misleading. The name means king lizard, and it was given by early paleontologists who initially mistook the fossils for those of a marine reptile. But Basilosaurus was no reptile. It was a mammal, a whale, albeit one that looked very different from any whale alive today. Basilosaurus was enormous, reaching lengths of 15 to 18 meters, roughly 50 to 60 feet. Its body was long and serpentine, giving it a snake-like appearance that was very different from the compact, streamlined body plan of modern whales. Its head was relatively small compared to its body length, with a long, narrow snout armed with differentiated teeth, a feature inherited from its terrestrial ancestors that is rare in modern cetaceans. The front teeth were conical, designed for grasping prey, while the rear teeth had multiple cusps, adapted for shearing flesh. The body of Basilosaurus was extraordinarily elongated, with an extended vertebral column that gave it its distinctive serpentine silhouette. Its front limbs had been modified into small, paddle-like flippers that were used for steering rather than propulsion. Most remarkably, Basilosaurus still possessed tiny hind limbs, vestigial remnants of the legs that its ancestors had used to walk on land. These hind limbs were far too small to serve any locomotory function. They were evolutionary leftovers, relics of a terrestrial past that the animal had long since abandoned. Some researchers have speculated that the vestigial hind limbs may have played a role in mating, serving as claspers during copulation, but this hypothesis remains unconfirmed. Basilosaurus propelled itself through the water using its powerful tail, which bore a horizontal fluke, a flattened, paddle-like structure that was driven up and down by powerful muscles along the spine. This up and down motion of the tail is characteristic of marine mammals and is fundamentally different from the side-to-side tail motion used by fish and most marine reptiles. It is an adaptation inherited from the terrestrial locomotion of the mammalian ancestors, in which the spine flexes vertically rather than laterally. The hunting behavior of Basilosaurus has been the subject of considerable research and speculation. Fossil evidence suggests that Basilosaurus was an active predator that fed on a variety of marine organisms, including fish, sharks, and crucially, other whales. One remarkable fossil find revealed a juvenile Dorodon, a smaller species of early whale, with tooth marks that matched the dentition of Basilosaurus. This suggests that Basilosaurus was not only a predator but also a cannibal of sorts, willing to attack and eat other cetaceans when the opportunity arose. The predatory behavior of Basilosaurus was likely aided by its large brain and well-developed senses. While the brain of Basilosaurus was relatively small compared to those of modern whales, it was still a mammalian brain, with all the associated advantages in terms of learning, memory, and behavioral flexibility. Its eyes were well developed, though not as large as those of some deep-diving cetaceans, suggesting that it hunted primarily in shallow to moderately deep waters where vision was a useful sense. Its hearing was probably also acute, though the specialized adaptations for underwater echolocation that characterize modern toothed whales had not yet evolved. Basilosaurus likely relied on a combination of vision, hearing, and possibly vibration sensitivity to locate and track its prey. Basilosaurus was the first mammal to truly dominate the oceans as an apex predator. Its size, its hunting ability, and its status at the top of the marine food chain made it the whale equivalent of Mosasaurus or Pliosaurus, a creature that ruled its world with unchallenged authority. It represented a new chapter in the history of ocean predation, the chapter in which warm-blooded, intelligent, air-breathing mammals replaced the cold-blooded reptiles and cartilaginous fish that had previously held the throne. But the age of Basilosaurus was relatively brief in geological terms. The environment was changing, the oceans were cooling, and new forms of whale were evolving, forms that were better adapted to the changing conditions. Basilosaurus and its close relatives declined and eventually disappeared, replaced by the ancestors of modern whales, both the baleen whales and the toothed whales, that would go on to fill the oceans with their descendants. And as the Paleogene gave way to the Neogene, the stage was being set for the arrival of what many people consider the greatest marine predator of all time. A creature that has captured the public imagination like few other prehistoric animals. A creature whose name alone conjures images of primal terror and oceanic destruction. Megalodon. The Neogene period, spanning from approximately 23 million years ago to roughly 2.6 million years ago, was a time of significant geological, climatic, and biological change. The continents were approaching their modern positions, though some important differences remained. The climate was generally warmer than today for much of the period, with higher sea levels and more extensive shallow marine habitats. The oceans were productive, teeming with marine mammals, fish, sea turtles, and seabirds, providing a rich and varied food base for predators. And the predator that rose to the top of this abundant ocean was Edestus megalodon, the largest predatory shark that has ever lived. The name Megalodon means big tooth, and it is an understatement. The teeth of Megalodon are among the most impressive fossils ever found, triangular blades of enamel and dentine that can measure over 7 inches in length, larger than a human hand. These teeth are found in marine sediments around the world, from every continent and every ocean basin, testament to the global distribution and ecological dominance of this extraordinary predator. Megalodon was not a great white shark, though it has often been depicted as an oversized version of one. While Megalodon and the great white shark do share some superficial similarities, and both belong to the order Lamniformes, they are not as closely related as was once believed. Megalodon belongs to the genus Omnidens, a lineage of large predatory sharks that evolved independently from the lineage that gave rise to the great white. The resemblance between the two is largely a product of convergent evolution, both animals evolving similar body plans in response to similar ecological pressures. But while their overall body plans may have been similar, the scale was dramatically different. Megalodon was vastly larger than any modern shark. Estimates of its maximum size vary depending on the method of estimation and the assumptions involved, but most researchers agree that the largest Megalodon specimens reach lengths of 15 to 18 meters, roughly 50 to 60 feet, with some estimates going as high as 20 meters or more. Its weight has been estimated at 40 to 60 metric tons or even higher, making it one of the heaviest predatory animals ever to have lived. To appreciate what a creature of this size was capable of, let us consider the tools at its disposal. Megalodon's jaws were enormous, wide enough for a person to stand inside them without crouching. The jaws were lined with rows of triangular, serrated teeth, each one a precision-cutting instrument designed for one purpose: to slice through flesh and bone with maximum efficiency. The serrations on each tooth were fine and regular, creating a saw-like edge that could carve through the thickest blubber, the toughest skin, and the densest bone with ease. The bite force of Megalodon has been estimated using computer models based on the size and shape of its jaws, and the likely mass of its jaw muscles. The results are almost beyond comprehension. Some estimates place the maximum bite force of Megalodon at over 180,000 newtons, roughly 10 times the bite force of a great white shark and more than 4 times the estimated bite force of Pliosaurus. This was by far the most powerful bite of any animal that has ever lived, a force capable of crushing the ribcage of a whale, of shattering bone, of devastating any biological structure that existed in the Neogene oceans. And what did Megalodon bite? The primary prey of Megalodon appears to have been marine mammals, specifically whales. The Neogene oceans were populated by a diverse array of cetaceans, including baleen whales, toothed whales, and various other marine mammal groups. Fossil evidence, including whale bones with Megalodon tooth marks and broken Megalodon teeth embedded in whale vertebrae, confirms that Megalodon actively hunted whales and that it did so with devastating effectiveness. The hunting strategy of Megalodon has been the subject of considerable speculation, informed by the fossil evidence and by analogy with the hunting behavior of modern great white sharks. One prominent hypothesis suggests that Megalodon targeted the high-value body parts of its prey, particularly the flippers and tail, delivering crippling bites that would immobilize the victim and prevent it from escaping. Once the prey was incapacitated, Megalodon could move in at leisure to feed on the carcass. This strategy is supported by the pattern of bite marks found on fossil whale bones. Many of these marks are concentrated on the flippers, the pectoral fins, and the caudal peduncle, the narrow part of the body just in front of the tail, exactly the areas that would need to be damaged to immobilize a whale. This suggests a predator that was not only powerful but also strategic, an animal that knew exactly where to strike for maximum effect. Other fossil evidence suggests that Megalodon may also have employed a ram-feeding strategy against larger prey, charging at high speed and delivering a devastating impact with its massive skull and jaws. This would have been a high-risk, high-reward strategy, suitable for use against the largest prey items, such as adult baleen whales that were too large to be immobilized by fin bites alone. The ecological impact of Megalodon on the marine ecosystems it inhabited must have been enormous. As a top predator of unparalleled size and power, Megalodon would have exerted a strong top-down influence on the entire food web. Its presence would have affected the behavior, distribution, and evolution of its prey species, much as modern apex predators like orcas influence the behavior and distribution of the animals they hunt. Whales in oceans patrolled by Megalodon may have altered their migration routes, their diving behavior, and their reproductive strategies in response to the risk of predation, though testing such hypotheses with the fossil record alone is extremely difficult. Megalodon reigned as the ocean's supreme predator for roughly 14 million years, from roughly 17 million years ago to approximately 3.6 million years ago. This was an extraordinarily long tenure for an apex predator, a testament to the effectiveness of its design and the stability of the marine ecosystems in which it lived. During this time, Megalodon was found in oceans worldwide, from the tropics to the temperate zones, everywhere that its whale prey could be found. But even Megalodon, the greatest predatory shark the world has ever known, was not immortal. Roughly 3.6 million years ago, Megalodon disappeared from the fossil record. The exact causes of its extinction are still debated, but several factors likely contributed to its demise. The global climate was cooling dramatically during the late Neogene, as the Earth entered the series of ice ages that would characterize the Pleistocene. Sea levels dropped, reducing the extent of the warm, shallow coastal waters that Megalodon preferred. The distribution and abundance of its prey species were changing as whale populations shifted in response to the cooling oceans. And new competitors were emerging, including the ancestors of modern orcas, highly social and intelligent predators that may have competed with Megalodon for access to whale prey. The extinction of Megalodon marked the end of the age of giant shark predators. Never again would a shark of comparable size and power patrol the world's oceans. The throne of the ocean's apex predator would pass to other animals, to the orcas and great white sharks that dominate the marine food web today. And with that, we arrive at the modern era, a world in which the oceans are ruled by predators that, while supremely effective and beautifully adapted for their roles, do not begin to approach the sheer scale and destructive power of their prehistoric predecessors. The orca, or killer whale, is often cited as the modern ocean's apex predator, and with good reason. Orcas are intelligent, social, and versatile hunters, capable of taking prey ranging from fish and squid to seals, sea lions, and even great whales. Their cooperative hunting strategies and their ability to learn and transmit cultural knowledge make them formidable predators by any standard. The great white shark, while perhaps the most feared marine predator in popular culture, is in many ways a shadow of its prehistoric ancestors. At maximum lengths of about 6 meters and weights of around 2 metric tons, it is a fraction of the size of Megalodon. Its bite force, while impressive, is a small fraction of what Megalodon could generate. And while the great white is an efficient and successful predator in its own right, it operates in an ocean that is vastly different from the one that supported the giant predators of the past. The story of the ocean's apex predators is, in many ways, the story of life itself. It is a story of innovation and extinction, of triumph and catastrophe, of relentless competition and constant adaptation. Every time the world was shattered by a mass extinction, every time the oceans were emptied and the food webs collapsed, new predators rose from the ashes, evolved to fill the vacant niches, and built new dynasties of dominance. From the tooth plates of Omnidens in the Cambrian to the serrated blades of Megalodon in the Neogene, The thread of apex predation runs unbroken through the entire history of complex life on Earth. Each of these predators was perfectly adapted to its time and its environment. Each was a masterpiece of evolution, honed by millions of years of natural selection into a killing machine of extraordinary efficiency. And each, no matter how successful, no matter how dominant, eventually fell, replaced by something new, something different, something better suited to the world that followed. This is the lesson of the fossil record. Dominance is temporary. Extinction is inevitable. But life itself endures, always finding new ways to fill the oceans with beauty and terror in equal measure. The seas that surround us today are still patrolled by predators, still governed by the ancient laws of the food chain, still shaped by the same evolutionary pressures that have been at work for more than 500 million years. The predators may be smaller now than they were in the past. The giant armored fish, the massive marine reptiles, the bus-sized sharks are all gone, their time on the stage of history completed. But the oceans remain what they have always been, a vast, beautiful, and unforgiving arena where the strong survive and the weak become food. And somewhere in the depths, in waters too deep and too dark for human eyes to penetrate, evolution is still working. Still experimenting. Still refining the ancient art of predation. The next chapter of the ocean's story has not yet been written, and we cannot know what form the next great predator will take. But if the past 500 million years have taught us anything, it is this: the ocean will always have its rulers, and those rulers will always be magnificent, and terrible, and ultimately mortal. The chronicle of teeth and bone continues, as it always has, as it always will, in the endless, ancient, blood-dark waters of the deep. The ocean does not remember its rulers kindly. It preserves them as stone, as scars in the rock, as teeth scattered across an ancient seabed, but it does not preserve their reigns. Their dominance was absolute in life, and then, in a moment of geological violence, it was erased. In the first part of this story, we followed the succession of those rulers across more than 500 million years, from the strange tooth-plated hunters of the Cambrian to the mountain-sized whale killers of the Neogene. We saw how the ocean has never been without an apex, how every catastrophe that emptied the seas was followed by a new evolution of something larger, something stronger, something more specialized for killing. Now we return to look closer. Not just at what these animals were, but at how they worked. How they were built, how they actually killed, how we know what we think we know, and why their worlds allowed monsters that no longer seem possible. This is the anatomy of terror, the engineering behind the bite, and the ecological story that connects one age of predators to the next. The Cambrian seas feel almost impossibly distant, but the physics that govern them were the same physics that govern the reefs today. Water is dense. Movement is expensive. Every adaptation that allows an animal to move faster, sense more clearly, or grip more securely pays an immediate dividend. In the Cambrian, the most valuable adaptation of all was a mouth that could handle armor. Many of the animals of the Cambrian explosion had evolved external skeletons, cuticle, plates, spines, not because they needed them to walk or to hold themselves upright, but because something was trying to eat them. Predation itself drove the explosion of hard parts. Omnidens sits directly in that arms race. For a long time, it was known only from isolated, almost featureless mouthparts that were mistaken for something else entirely. The fossils originally described as Omnidens were enormous by Cambrian standards, dark, triangular structures with rows of jagged cones that looked like they belonged to a much later animal. We now understand that these were the oral cone elements, the feeding apparatus of a large free-swimming predator. The body that carried them was soft, muscular, and likely lobopod-like, with stubby, unjointed legs covered in fine annulations, capable of crawling on the bottom and swimming in short lunges. What makes Omnidens distinct is the organization of its feeding system. Where many Cambrian predators used a simple ring of plates to pull food into the mouth, the apparatus of Omnidens was reinforced, with paired tooth plates that opposed each other. The teeth are not like vertebrate teeth. They are not set in sockets, they do not grow and replace in a jawbone. They are hard and cuticle, like the mouthparts of a modern priapulid worm, but scaled up to a scale that defies analogy. The cusps are sharp, recurved, and graded in size, the largest at the center of the plate and smaller toward the edges, forming a crushing and shredding surface. When the proboscis everted, when the throat turned inside out and thrust outward, these plates would have met in the middle, impaling and dragging. This was not a predator that swallowed tiny plankton. Coprolites and gut contents associated with similar Cambrian hunters preserve fragments of trilobite exoskeleton, bradoreid carapaces, and hyalus shells. Omnidens was capable of attacking animals that were themselves armored, which means it was breaking through the best defenses of its time. The force required would have been generated not by jaw muscles, because it had no jaws, but by hydraulic pressure. The entire anterior end of the body could be inflated with fluid, forcing the mouthparts outward with sudden pressure, while longitudinal muscles retracted it with equal violence. It was a punch made of its own throat. Its size matters. While estimates based only on mouthparts are inherently uncertain, the dimensions of the Omnidens plates dwarf those of an Ammalocaris, indicating an animal that may have exceeded 1.5 meters in length. In an ocean where almost everything else was less than 10 centimeters long, a predator of that size did not need speed to be apex. It needed reach and processing power, and that is exactly what the tooth plates provided. The Cambrian had invented the concept of an apex predator, and Omnidens was one of its first perfect expressions. That concept would be inherited, but not by relatives. The transition into the Ordovician was not just a change in species, it was a change in physics. The seas rose, flooding vast continental areas and creating enormous shallow epiric seas that were warm, nutrient-rich, and saturated with dissolved calcium carbonate. Animals that could build shells of calcite and aragonite suddenly had unlimited building material. The reef builders moved in, the filter feeders boomed, and the food chain grew taller. Endoceras was not clever. It was inevitable. The nautiloid body plan is one of the oldest solutions to a simple problem: how to live in the water column without constantly spending energy to stay there. The cone-shaped shell of Endoceras was divided internally by septa, into chambers. The animal lived only in the newest, largest chamber at the opening. The older chambers were emptied of fluid and partially filled with gas, regulated by a strand of vascular tissue called the siphuncle that ran through the center of every septum. By actively pumping ions through the wall of the siphuncle, the animal could change the osmotic pressure, drawing water out of a chamber, or allowing it to flow back in, adjusting buoyancy with exquisite precision. The giant straight shells, the orthocones, were not streamlined in the modern sense. They were long, like spears. An Endoceras of full size, up to 6 or even 9 meters if we include the most fragmentary specimens, would have been a poor sprinter. It would have moved by jet propulsion, expelling water from its hyponome, a muscular funnel under the head, contracting its mantle and forcing water backward. The principle is the same used by a modern squid, but in an animal that heavy, the acceleration would have been sluggish. It did not chase. It drifted. The hunting method of a giant orthocone has been reconstructed by looking at modern nautilus behavior and at the damage patterns on the shells of its prey. It had large, well-developed eyes, camera eyes not unlike our own, though evolved independently, capable of detecting motion and shadow. It had dozens of narrow, suckerless tentacles, perhaps as many as 90, which were strong and highly innervated. It would have approached from below or from the side, where its already mottled or countershaded shell would have broken up its silhouette, and then it would have struck with a sudden flare of its tentacles. Once the tentacles seized a trilobite, its prey would have been pulled inward toward the beak. That beak was 2 parts, upper and lower, made of chitin reinforced with calcium carbonate, sharp as shears. The bite force was not comparable to a vertebrate jaw, because the muscles were arranged concentrically around the buccal mass, but it was sufficient to punch through mineralized exoskeleton. We have fossil trilobites with symmetrical, U-shaped bite marks that match the dimensions of nautiloid beaks, and we have orthocone body chambers that contain dense masses of trilobite debris. Endoceras and its kin represent the first time the pelagic zone, the open water away from the seafloor, had a predator too large to be challenged. It is the dynasty of cephalopods that would later produce the ammonites, the belemnites, and eventually the colossal squids of today, but in the Ordovician, It was at its most massive and most primitive. And then the world froze. The Ordovician glaciation was triggered by a change in the position of the continents that isolated polar waters and shifted oceanic circulation. Ice sheets grew at the South Pole, sea levels dropped by as much as 100 meters, oceans cooled, and anoxic waters expanded from the deep. The intricate reef systems that had fed dinosaurs collapsed. The orthocones, dependent on warm, shallow, highly productive carbonate environments for much of their life cycle, were hit especially hard. Most of the giant species vanished. Their empty mid-water niche did not remain empty for long. The Silurian that followed was a greenhouse recovery world, warm again, with high sea levels but different chemistry. And the rulers were arthropods, but not like the soft-bodied Cambrian ones. The Eurypterids, the sea scorpions, were chelicerates, related to spiders and horseshoe crabs. They possessed a tough, sclerotized exoskeleton made of chitin and proteins, jointed appendages moved by antagonistic muscles and hydraulic pressure, and compound eyes that in some species rivaled those of modern dragonflies in resolution. Gecalopterus rhenani is known from a handful of spectacular fragments found in what was once a brackish estuary and lagoon system, a place where rivers met the sea, where salt and fresh water mixed, where visibility was low and detritus was high. That environment was perfect for an ambush predator. The animal itself was built like an armored galley. Its body consisted of 12 segmented plates affixed to a broad, horseshoe-shaped prosoma, the head shield. Underneath that shield were 6 pairs of appendages. The first were the chelicerae, enormous, more than 46 centimeters long in the largest specimen, with a fixed and movable ramus that closed like a pair of pliers but lined with teeth that were themselves serrated on the front edge. The mechanical advantage of this chelicera was enormous. By pivoting near the base and applying force from a massive internal muscle bundle attached to the apodeme, it could snap shut with low speed but with immense holding force. Once closed, the interlocking teeth would have prevented any struggle. Pairs 2 through 4 were walking legs, ending in spines for moving over soft sediment and for manipulating prey toward the gnathobases, the spiny bases of the legs that functioned as jaws, shredding food before it entered the mouth. Pair 5 was larger, and pair 6 was expanded into broad, flat swimming paddles with a series of blades that overlapped to form a single surface on the power stroke and feathered on the recovery stroke. Behind the prosoma, the opistosoma tapered into a broad, flat telson. This was not a stinger. It had no venom gland. It was a rudder. An animal 2.5 meters long, weighing perhaps over 100 kilograms, could not have been a fast swimmer in the style of a fish. Gecalopterus was probably an ambush predator that rested partially buried in sediment, its eyes just above the silt, its paddles tucked. Its vision was acute. Each eye sat on the side of the prosoma, and was composed of thousands of individual lenses. It would have been extremely sensitive to movement across the murky bottom. When a vertebrate, an early fish like a head-shielded osteostracon or a smaller eurypterid like Parastylonurus came within range, the attack would have been a sudden extension of the chelicerae, driven forward by hydrostatic pressure, followed by a drag inward. Freshwater deposits containing Gecalopterus also contain coprolites packed with fish scales and fragments of arthropod cuticle, showing that it processed both. The ability of Gecalopterus to live in both salt and fresh water was its superpower, but also its doom. Fresh water is physiologically challenging for a large marine arthropod because it must constantly pump ions inward and excrete excess water. Eurypterids had developed specialized gill tracts on their abdominal plates that functioned as both gills and excretory organs. This adaptability let them invade rivers where no large predators existed, turning them into terrors of every waterway. But when jawed fishes, which had kidneys far more efficient at handling fresh water, began to evolve in those same rivers during the late Silurian and early Devonian, the Eurypterids found themselves outcompete for the very habitat they had pioneered. That next chapter belongs to the fish. The Devonian is rightly named the Age of Fishes, but it could equally be called the Age of Armor. The placoderms were gnathostomes, true-jawed vertebrates, and their jaw was one of the most significant inventions in vertebrate history. The upper jaw was formed by the fusion of several skull plates, immobile, while the lower jaw was a lever hinged behind the orbit. The jaw was not moved by a single muscle but by a complex 4-bar linkage system, where the opening of the jaw protruded it forward and the closing drove the gnathal plates together like a pair of scissors made of solid bone. In Edestus, this system reached its ultimate expression. The skull could be up to more than a meter long and 60 centimeters deep, made of interlocking bony plates that were up to several centimeters thick in cross-section. The plates were not solid bone, but consisted of an outer layer of dense dermal bone overlaying a spongy, cancellous interior that absorbed shock. The surface was ornamented with tubercles and ridges, possibly for sensory display, but the inner edges of the plates that formed the bite were different. They were sharp. There were no true teeth. The bite surface was a sharp, inflected blade of the dermal bone itself, the infraognathal and supraognathal. Histological sections show these blades were maintained by continuous growth at the base and abrasion at the tip. As the animal bit, the blades scraped past one another, shearing. Micro-scratch analysis of the blade's surfaces shows that this self-sharpening maintained an edge that at times was less than half a millimeter thick. Biomechanical modeling using finite element analysis and muscle reconstruction from muscle attachment scars suggests that Edestus could open its jaws in as little as 60 milliseconds, generating a suction pulse that drew water and prey inward as the floor of the mouth dropped. The closing was even faster. The calculated bite force at the anterior fawn-like projection of the blade was around 8,000 newtons. At the posterior crushing section, it was over 1,000 pounds per square inch multiplied across a much smaller surface. What that does to prey is catastrophic. There are Devonian fossil assemblages where Edestus is preserved alongside flattened arthrodires, smaller placoderms that show clean, bilateral shear marks exactly matching the spacing of the supraognathal blades. Edestus was not just slicing flesh. It was slicing through fellow armored fish, cutting their articulated armor like sheet metal. Mass accumulations of partially digested bone in the sediment near Edestus skulls have been interpreted as regurgitolites, vomited bone masses, indicating an animal that could eat far more bone than it could digest, much like an owl. Edestus did not hunt like a shark. Its body behind the armored shield was largely unarmored, covered in skin and scales, with a powerful heterocircle tail. Its head was too heavy for sustained high-speed cruising. It was the Devonian equivalent of a snapping turtle, holding station near reefs or in channel bottlenecks and using explosive lunges. But the reefs themselves were disappearing. The Kellwasser and Hayenberg events, two pulses of the late Devonian extinction, were caused by widespread deep-water anoxa that spread onto the shelves, possibly linked to the radiation of land plants which caused intense weathering and nutrient runoff and global algal blooms. The placoderms, which had become specialists of reef and nearshore predation, could not survive the collapse of that habitat. In a geologically brief instant, an entire body plan that had ruled for 60 million years was erased. Not a single placoderm crossed into the Carboniferous. What did cross was the smaller, faster, cartilage skeleton animal that had been living in their shadow. The sharks. The early Carboniferous was a shark renaissance unlike anything before or after. Freed from the placoderms, sharks radiated into almost every shape the cartilaginous skeleton permits. Most of this diversity belongs to the extinct group Eugeniodontida, which are not true sharks in the modern crown group but close relatives. Their dentitions were not designed to be disposable. Edestus, the scissor-tooth, embodies this. The tooth whorl of Edestus was not a whorl in the spiral sense, but a symphyseal tooth row, a single stack of teeth growing one behind the other directly in the midline of the upper and lower jaws. The older teeth were not shed. They were pushed forward by the growth of new teeth behind them, and the entire stack was retained. Histology of the bases shows no resorption pits, so the teeth remained fused to one another in life. The result was a pair of curved, bony saw blades protruding from the mouth, the upper curving downward, the lower curving upward, like the blades of a pinking shear. How did it eat? The earliest reconstruction assumed it slashed side to side, but more recent work on toothware suggests the edges are abraded in a way consistent with vertical occlusion, the teeth sliding past each other like scissors. The teeth themselves are triangular, with fine serrations and a large, bulbous root that would anchor them against lateral forces. Breakage analysis shows that many teeth broke not from impact but from torsion, implying struggling prey twisted against them. Models suggest Edestus hunted large, soft-bodied prey such as other sharks and perhaps large amphibians entering brackish waters, gripping with the symphyseal blades while lateral palatal teeth, which were smaller and pavement-like, secured. Estimates of Edestus' size vary, but by comparing the largest known blade, which is over 20 centimeters long and retains at least a dozen crowns, to the jaw proportions of related eugenodonts preserved in the Bear Gulch limestone, we arrive at lengths of 6 to 7 meters, mass perhaps over a ton. It lived in tropical coal swamp seas, where visibility was poor and prey was abundant. It was not a refined predator. It was a cutting machine in a murk where cutting was enough. But the coal swamps were building a death trap. As the continents converged into Pangaea, the climate oscillated between humid and arid, the seas repeatedly rose and fell, and volcanism intensified. By the Permian, eugenodonts were still present, but their star specimen had changed to the Helicoprionidae. Parahelicoprion is a close cousin of the famous Helicoprion, but larger and with teeth that were less tightly coiled. Its tooth whorl was truly spiral, a continuous logarithmic spiral of more than 150 crowns in some individuals, the youngest, largest crowns on the outside, the smallest, oldest completely capped inside. For over 100 years, no one could figure out where this spiral sat. It was postulated as being on the snout, like an ammonite stuck to a fish's nose, or on the tail, or as a defensive structure. It took industrial CT scanning of a specimen embedded in a hard limestone concretion from the Phosphoria Basin to settle it. The spiral sits in the middle of the mandible, nestled inside the throat, the outer teeth sloping outward and downward, the whorl itself housed in a recessed trough in the lower jaw cartilage. The function is now believed to be gouging. The fish did not chew. It made a rapid upward snap of the lower jaw while the muscular tongue and basiheel drove the prey down against the whorl. As the jaw closed, successive crowns hooked and sliced, like a conveyor belt of knives pulling tissue into the mouth. Where patterns on the enamelite caps show that the cusps were used to rake backward, not to crush. Stomach contents of helicoprionids are rare, but preserved impressions of coleoid soft tissue and broken cephalopod hooklets have been found in association. Parahelicoprion likely reached lengths approaching 5 to 8 meters. It was a long snout, tuna-shaped chondrichthyon with large eyes, inhabiting open-shelf seas. It fed primarily on cephalopods, ammonids and orthoceratodes and early squid-like forms that were abundant in the Median seas. Its saw was perfect for prey that was too slippery to grab but too large to swallow. It would slash, release, slash again, letting blood and ink cloud the water, then circle back to consume the disabled fragments. None of that saved it. The end Permian extinction, the Great Dying, was driven by the Siberian traps, a flood basalt province that put enough carbon into the atmosphere to raise global temperatures by 10 degrees and acidify the oceans to a degree that prevented most carbonate-secreting animals from building shells. The eugenodonts, which had persisted through 2 previous extinctions, could not cross this threshold. Their cartilage skeletons left little fossil record in the earliest Triassic, and when the records do resume, they are gone. The ocean following that event was almost lifeless, hot, low in oxygen, and strange. The first 20 million years of the Triassic, the early and middle Triassic, were a bottleneck. But by the late Triassic, life was rebuilding, and marine reptiles had taken the initiative. Ichthyosaurs evolved extraordinarily quickly. Their earliest forms, like Chaohurus, were small, lizard-like swimmers with long, flexible bodies. Within 10 million years, they had evolved into dolphin-shaped pursuit predators with a deep tail fork and a dorsal fin, a structure not supported by bone, only by soft tissue, which is why we only know its shape from exceptional impressions. Their eyes were disproportionately huge, with scleral rings up to 25 centimeters in diameter in the largest species, indicating animals that hunted in low light, perhaps deep diving. Ichthyodonton waits at the very end of the Triassic, in the Rhaetian, just a few million years before the Triassic-Jurassic extinction. Its fossils come from bone beds that preserved disarticulated, often massive isolated limb and jaw elements in shallow marine sandstones that represent storm deposits. The fossils are not complete skeletons but enormous isolated pieces, especially portions of the surangular, the bone that makes up the back of the lower jaw. Comparing the surangular of Ichthyodoton severnensis to that of a fully known shastosaurid like Shanosaurus sicaniensis, and scaling isometrically, gives a body length of roughly 25 meters. There are even larger fragments that may suggest animals exceeding that. An animal this size is a physics revolution. At 25 meters and perhaps tens of tons, it is no longer sensitive to the same energetic costs as a dolphin. The cost of transport per unit mass falls dramatically as body size increases. The thermal inertia becomes enormous, meaning a large ectothermic or gigantothermic animal can maintain a stable internal temperature in cold, deep waters. The lung volume and blood oxygen capacity scale such that the animal can make dives measured in hours, not minutes. What did it eat? Its teeth, where preserved in relatives, are relatively small, widely spaced, and blunt compared to the cutting teeth of a predator like Pliosaurus. Many of the largest shastosaurids show heavy tooth where consistent with suction feeding. The current leading hypothesis is that Ichthyodoton was a suction or ram suction feeder engulfing large soft-bodied cephalopods and possibly small fish in great mouthfuls, like a giant, reptilian sperm whale but without echolocation. The energy density of a single giant Triassic ammonid could sustain such a bulk-feeding strategy. The jaw, long and relatively gracile for its length, was not designed to crush bone, but to open wide and create a sudden drop cavity. Ichthyodoton vanishes at the end of the Triassic, alongside many of its prey. The end Triassic extinction was triggered by the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, another massive volcanic episode that caused rapid warming and ocean acidification. The Shastosaurid giants were lost, and the more specialized parvipelvian ichthyosaurs of the Jurassic never again reached such size, as if the specific oceanographic conditions that allowed a reptile to become whale-sized had passed. The Jurassic Sea that followed belonged to new dynasties. The pliosaurs emerged as the high-mass predator solution for the Jurassic. Pliosaurus, especially the large species Pliosaurus funke and Pliosaurus cavani from the Kimmeridge clay deposits, was the archetype of the macrophagous superpredator. The skull of Pliosaurus is 40% of the debate and 100% of the legend. 2 meters long in the largest individuals, it was built for strength. The rostrum was broad, not tube-like. The bone was heavily pachyostotic, thickened and dense, reducing buoyancy and allowing rapid diving. The temporal fenestrae, the openings behind the eye sockets for jaw muscles, were enormous, housing adductor muscles as thick as a human thigh. Reconstructions based on muscle scar volume and comparisons to saltwater crocodiles, which have a similar skull width to muscle mass ratio, suggest bite forces between 27,000 and 42,000 newtons at the posterior teeth, with some theoretical maxima even higher near the hinge of the jaw. The teeth were trihedral in cross-section, with a flat outer face and 2 inner faces converging at a keel, making them resistant to bending and twisting forces. Enamel ridges ran down their length, preventing crack propagation. Behaviorally, Pliosaurus hunted large. The Kimmeridgian seas were full of long-necked plesiosaurs like Chimerosaurus, Cryptoclitids, fast Elatosaucian crocodilians, and ichthyosaurs like Ophthalmosaurus. All of these turn up as stomach contents inside large thalassophonian pliosaurs. A partially digested plesiosaur limb bone inside a pliosaurus gut shows acid etching but no tooth marks, meaning it was severed and swallowed whole. An ichthyosaur vertebra shows punctures that match the spacing and angle of Pliosaurus teeth. Its hunting technique is inferred to be ambush from depth. Large eyes angled upward, nares placed far forward to breathe with minimal surface exposure, and highly sensitive neurovascular foramina on the snout tip that in modern analogs detect pressure changes, gave it the ability to detect prey ripples above. The four-paddle locomotion of plesiosaurs is unique. Using asynchronous flapping of fore and hind flippers, similar to a sea turtle but with far greater power, a Pliosaurus could turn essentially within its own body length, accelerate vertically, and maintain stealth by eliminating the tail flick that gives bony fish away. A pliosaurus would launch, seize prey near the base of the neck or flank where thrashing was hardest, and either crush immediately or roll, using its own weight to twist off flesh, a behavior convergent with modern crocodiles. 42,000 newtons is sufficient to fracture turtle shell, sever a flipper, and puncture the brain case of another marine reptile. Nothing swam safely above it. But after the Jurassic, the pliosaurs waned, outcompete by a faster, more metabolically flexible rival that had evolved from coastal lizards. The mosasaurs. Mosasaurus is not a dinosaur, though it lived with them, and that matters for how it breathed and moved. As a squamate, it had a kinetic skull with hinged joints, especially a doubly articulated jaw that could flex. The lower jaw could bow outward at the symphysis. The connection between left and right dentaries was flexible, not fused, allowing the mouth to distort around large prey. The famous second set of teeth on the pteryg, on the roof of the mouth, pointed backward and were independently movable, raking food toward the throat in a motion similar to a snake. Mosasaurus hoffmanii grew to estimated lengths of 13 to 17 meters. Its body was not like a plesiosaur. It had lost the rigid plesiosaur trunk. Its vertebral column allowed lateral undulation, and its tail developed a hypocercal fin, a downward bend of the spine supporting an enlarged, crescent-shaped fluke much like a shark. This is known from exceptional specimens preserving scales and tail outlines. Propulsion came from tail sweeps. The paddles, while large, were hydrofoils for steering and for pitch control during high-speed attacks. The sense suite of Mosasaurus was complete. The middle ear was adapted to perceive underwater sound through bone conduction, not through an air-filled tympanum. The semicircular canals of the inner ear indicate an animal capable of rapid, agile acceleration, as they are large and highly arched, unlike those of slower marine reptiles. Chemical sense was acute. Mosasaurs likely used a tongue-flicking behavior, retrieving water samples and delivering them to Jacobson's organ in the palate, giving them the ability to follow a blood trail for kilometers. Diet proves predatory supremacy. A specimen of Mosasaurus from the tight Maastrichtian deposits contains the acid-etched bones of a sea bird inside its gut. Other specimens contain smaller mosasaurs, including Cleidasts and Prognathodon, indicating active cannibalism. There are concentrations of globidensine mosasaur and turtle shells with Mosasaurus bite marks showing shattered carapaces. It was not scavenging in those cases. The bite punctures show impact fractures and no healing, meaning perimodern predation. The power of Mosasaurus was not only its jaws but its metabolic endurance. Oxygen isotope analysis of its teeth and bones suggests a mesothermic physiology, preserving core heat by countercurrent exchange in the limbs and torso, allowing it to maintain high muscle performance even in cooler, deeper waters of the inland sea. This would have given it a sustained speed advantage over ectothermic prey. In short, it could keep chasing when other reptiles would tire and cool. Its end was not a failure of evolution. The asteroid that created the Chicxulub crater at the close of the Cretaceous did not select against strength. It selected against food webs that relied on photosynthetic productivity. As dust darkened the skies, phytoplankton blooms collapsed. Ammonites, the base of so much of mosasaur prey, disappeared almost instantly on a geological scale. Large predators cannot downsize fast enough when prey vanishes. The recovery took millions of years. When it did return, the apex predator was warm-blooded in a different way. Mammalian. Basilosaurus is a predator whose anatomy betrays a recent land ancestry in every bone. Its skull is not tubular like a modern dolphin, it is elongated and robust with a distinct sagittal crest for temporalis muscles, inherited from its artiodactyl ancestors. Its heterodont dentition is mammalian. There are sharp, single-cusped incisors, large conical canines, and complex premolars and molars with multiple roots and accessory cusps, showing slicing and shearing not seen in modern odontocetes. The upper molars occlude with lower in a scissor-like action, and heavy spalling and breakage on the crowns indicate bone processing. The postcranium is bizarre by modern cetacean standards. Its vertebral formula is elongated to over 65 vertebrae, most of them in the thoracolumbar region, making the spine extremely long and flexible in the vertical plane but relatively inflexible laterally. A modern whale of similar length has roughly 50 vertebrae. The result is a snake-like body, an undulatory swimmer that increased its propulsive wave length by sheer segment count. The forelimbs are true paddles with fused wrist bones and flattened phalanges, but the elbow joint is still mobile, not fused like in modern whales. And behind the pelvic region, connected to no vertebra and fully encased in muscle and fat, are tiny but complete hind limbs with a femur, patella, tibia, and 3 digits, each less than 30 centimeters long and a 15-meter animal. Ecologically, Basilosaurus was an intercontinental predator of late Eocene shallow seas that were still warm and productive, the Tethys and early Paratethys. Mass death assemblages from L-Phaeum preserve not only adult Basilosaurus but also juveniles and copious Dorodon calves with tooth marks consistent with predation. One skull of Dorodon shows a crushed brain case matching the upper canines of Basilosaurus. These deposits are interpreted as calving grounds for Dorodon that were exploited by Basilosaurus like seals on modern beaches, picking off newborns. Its hearing was different from modern whales. The periodic bones, which house the middle ear, are dense and decoupled from the skull by fat pads, the first step toward underwater directional hearing, but the cochlea lacks the extreme high-frequency specialization for echolocation. Basilosaurus likely hunted by sight and passive listening, perhaps detecting the low-frequency calls of other whales. It was a surface hunter, not a deep diver. Its rib cage was lightly built, its lungs large and less collapsible than those of a deep-diving sperm whale, and its nostrils, though migrated to the top of the skull, had not yet fused into a single external blowhole with a nasal plug valve for repeated deep dives. It was eventually outpaced by 2 trends. Climate cooled into the Oligocene, polar ice caps formed, sea levels dropped, and the shallow Tethys broke up. And both odontocetes with echolocation and baleen whales with filter feeding began to radiate. Basilosaurus, as a large-toothed raptorial predator without echolocation, could not compete with the new predators that could hunt in darker or deeper water or with filter feeders that could exploit smaller, more abundant prey. The final giant was something else entirely. Not a reptile, not a mammal, but the last and largest iteration of the shark plan. Otidus Megalodon is not called Carcharochles or Carcharodon now, but its lineage is unambiguous, a direct descendant from the broad-toothed Otidus obliquus through Carcharochles angustidens to Chubutensis. This is a 300-million-year unbroken chain of cartilaginous fish. The teeth are its biography. A typical upper anterior tooth of a large adult is over 18 centimeters diagonally, including root, with a broad, triangular crown, fine, uniform serrations, and a thick, U-shaped burlette, a dark chevron between crown and root unique to Megalodon. The serrations themselves are irregular at high magnification, and their size correlates with bite damage depth. Larger serrations slice deeper before snagging. Full-body reconstructions rely on great white analogues, but with a correction factor. Megalodon was not just a scaled-up great white. Its proportions were likely stockier, with a broader rostrum, a more massive pectoral girdle, and a heavier axial skeleton, as reflected by vertebral centra up to 23 centimeters in diameter found in Belgium and California. Using mass estimates derived from crown height and from vertebral diameter regressed against white shark body mass, a mature adult of 15 to 18 meters would have weighed 50 to 70 tons, larger than a whaling ship's launch. The largest estimates of 20 meters are based on fragmentary teeth exceeding 19 centimeters and correspond to animals perhaps over 100 tons, though these remain debated. The bite. Using computerized tomography of the chondrocranium of white sharks and scaling muscle cross-section with positive allometry, studies arrived at bite forces of 108,000 to 182,000 newtons for Megalodon, the highest of any known animal, living or extinct. This is not just about muscle. It is about leverage. Megalodon had a massively broad skull, giving insertion for adductor mandibulae muscles that ran not just behind the orbit but far forward, shortening the outlever. Its jaws were also almost circular in gape, like a trash compactor, distributing force across a curved line of teeth. When it bit down on a whale, the teeth did not just cut. The root pressed the crown through blubber with a force that fractured ribs without the teeth ever touching them, the pressure alone rupturing vasculature. Prey evidence is concentrated on mastocetes. In Pliocene marine deposits, cetacean vertebrae and ribs show two distinct bite traces. Small, parallel scores indicating raking when Megalodon slashed past, and large, deep punctures with crushed internal trabeculae indicating a direct killing bite. Several fossil baleen whale skulls show the nasals and frontals sheared off, consistent with a bite that severed the spine at the base of the skull, incapacitating before feeding. This predatory focus on the thoracic cavity, the most blubber-rich region, suggests a caloric strategy. A single adult whale represented a month of energy for Megalodon, unlike a seal for a white shark. Why did it disappear roughly 3.6 million years ago, far before humans? Multiple stressors align. The Central American seaway closed, changing global thermohaline circulation, intensifying cold upwelling and collapsing tropical nursery areas for both Megalodon and baleen whales. The Messinian salinity crisis and subsequent coldification dropped sea level, eliminating the shallow, protected inland bays Megalodon used as nurseries, where juvenile teeth are found in high density, and where small juveniles would have been safe from larger sharks and orcas. At the same time, modern baleen whales began their radiation into larger, migratory, open ocean forms that spent winters in high-latitude cold waters where Megalodon, with a likely regional endothermy but poor cold tolerance compared to truly endothermic mammals, could not follow. Meanwhile, cooperative hunting orcas with superior cognitive ability and pack tactics emerged in the fossil record, competing for the same weakened whale carcasses and perhaps even directly predating juvenile Megalodon. Its fall created the world we see now. A modern orca is a 12-ton, 8-meter intelligent projectile. Its teeth are peg-like, conical, up to 10 centimeters long, designed not to cut but to hold. Its predation relies not on raw tissue destruction but on asphyxiation, tearing, and exhaustion inflicted by a pod working as a unit. Their cooperation allows them to take prey far larger than themselves, something no solitary predator could reliably accomplish. A great white shark of 6 meters generates a bite around 18,000 newtons, 10 times less than Megalodon, but with a much more efficient hunting brain that learns seal traffic patterns, ambushes from below with vertical burst acceleration exceeding 20 miles per hour, and can detect a single drop of blood in a vast volume of water through olfaction and electrosense mediated by the ampullae of Lorenzini. They are efficient. They are adaptable. They are smaller. That smallness matters. The oceans today are less productive at the top predator level than during the Miocene-Pliocene warm periods. More carbon is locked in ice, more nutrients are tied up in polar front systems rather than broad tropical shelf systems. Oxygen levels, while stable, are lower than during parts of the Paleozoic and Mesozoic peaks when gigantism was chemically easier to support. Perhaps most importantly, pregnancy in marine mammals takes up to 18 months, and a 6-meter shark can produce hundreds of pups but only a few surviving, whereas a 20-meter, 70-ton super predator requires an enormous prey base of whales producing calves every 2 years to sustain a viable breeding population. The trophic pyramid simply cannot support as many tons of apex now. And so the succession pauses, or appears to. For 500 million years, the story was replacement. After every collapse, something new grew larger and more specialized, pushing the physical envelope of what flesh and muscle could do underwater. From a throat that averted to drag prey into a tooth-plated mouth, to a spear of shell floating on gas, to a scorpion with pliers for jaws, to an armored fish whose own jaws sharpened themselves each time they closed, to a shark that turned its entire mouth into protruding shears, to a fish with a circular saw hidden inside its chin, to a reptile longer than a blue whale hunting blind cephalopods, to a marine monster whose bite could crush a car, to an agile, serpentine leviathan that gave its forelimbs to the sea but kept tiny legs hidden within, to a lightly built, crocodile-headed sea lizard that devoured everything from birds to its own kin, to a shark whose teeth were the size of human hands and whose bite eclipsed any force nature had ever produced. Each was the best solution its world ever produced. Each dominated absolutely. Each fell. What remains is a chain written in stone, in the serrations on a 7-inch tooth, in the puncture marks on an ancient whale skull, in a selenite-filled eye socket that once watched murky rivers. The ocean has never been safe, it has only changed the shape of the thing you should fear.